They were not built to be homes. They were built to be statements. Across America, enormous estates rose from quiet land, designed to announce power before a single word was spoken. Stone, iron, and money shaped them into monuments of control, not comfort. To the public, they symbolized success. To those inside, they were something else entirely. Because behind the gates, wealth did not mean peace. It meant pressure. It meant secrecy. It meant consequences that never made the headlines. These estates were created during an era when power had no brakes, when fortunes grew faster than laws, and when influence could buy silence. Every corridor was designed to impress. Every room existed to remind visitors who held authority. But the true cost of these places was never written on blueprints. What few people realize is that many of these estates did not survive because they failed. They vanished because they revealed too much. As generations passed, the buildings became liabilities. They exposed how wealth was created, how labor was erased, and how power protected itself. And when that truth became uncomfortable, the estates were abandoned, repurposed, or quietly destroyed. What replaced them was not fairness. It was something far more efficient. Today, the land remains. The influence remains. The systems remain. Only the evidence is gone. This is the story of the estates that shaped America's elite, the legacy they left behind, and the price of power that never truly disappears. Stay with us, because once you see what these mansions really represented, you'll never look at American wealth the same way again. Long before their names became inseparable from American power, before balance sheets and boardrooms replaced ballrooms and terraces, the dynasty announced itself through land. Not through factories or banks alone, but through estates that reshaped landscapes and redefined what wealth was allowed to look like. These were not homes built for comfort. They were declarations. Each mansion, each gate, each mile of manicured ground served as a physical argument that influence could be inherited, fortified, and made permanent through stone and soil. The first estates rose during a moment when America was still unsure of its identity. The nation spoke the language of democracy, but its economy rewarded concentration. Rail lines expanded, industries hardened, and capital flowed upward with unprecedented speed. The dynasty understood something early that others learned later. Power that can be seen is power that can be defended. Their estates were positioned deliberately, overlooking cities, coastlines, and transportation routes, ensuring visibility without vulnerability. From a distance, they inspired awe. Up close, they enforced separation. Construction of these properties relied on an army of laborers whose names were never recorded in family histories. Immigrants quarried stone, shaped iron, planted gardens, and slept in temporary quarters far from the finished grandeur. The estates were built through efficiency and exhaustion, through systems that rewarded output while ignoring cost. Once complete, the structures erased the process of their own creation. Visitors saw polished marble and symmetry, never the injuries, the long hours, or the communities displaced to make room for lawns that would never be walked by those who built them. Inside the estates, architecture taught lessons without words. Grand staircases drew the eye upward, reinforcing hierarchy. Long corridors separated public display from private decision-making. Servants' passages were narrow, hidden, and deliberately inconvenient, ensuring labor remained unseen. Space itself became an instrument of control. Guests learned where they belonged by the size of the room they were invited into, and employees learned invisibility as a requirement rather than a role. These estates were not isolated indulgences. They functioned as informal headquarters of influence. Political conversations unfolded beside fireplaces. Financial alliances were sealed over dinners that lasted hours. Decisions affecting railroads, markets, and labor policy were made far from public scrutiny, shielded by the social ritual of hospitality. By framing power as culture, the dynasty blurred the line between private wealth and public consequence. The surrounding communities felt the presence of these estates even if they never crossed the gates. Entire local economies bent around their needs. Roads were redirected, services prioritized, land values distorted. What appeared as generosity through employment masked dependency. Towns survived by serving wealth they could never access. The estates did not merely occupy space, they reorganized it. Over time, the dynasty's identity became inseparable from these properties. Photographs circulated, newspaper descriptions lingered on scale and refinement. Excess was translated into taste, and inequality into tradition. The estates transformed wealth into heritage, shifting attention from how power was gained to how long it had existed. Longevity replaced scrutiny. The longer the dynasty endured, the more legitimate it appeared. Yet even at their height, these estates carried tension beneath their calm surfaces. The nation beyond the gates was changing. Workers organized, journalists exposed abuses. Public trust and unchecked wealth began to fracture. While the estates remained immaculate, the systems sustaining them faced growing resistance. Strikes disrupted industries tied to the dynasty's fortune. Protests questioned the morality of concentrated power. The estates absorbed these pressures silently, continuing their rituals as though permanence were guaranteed. Inheritance complicated everything. New G. Generations inherited land they had not chosen, and power they did not fully understand. Some embraced the role, preserving traditions with precision. Others felt trapped by scale and expectation. Maintaining these estates required enormous resources. Heating empty wings, restoring aging stone, staffing rooms no longer used became acts of obligation rather than pride. The estates that once symbolized dominance began to feel like anchors. Public perception shifted further. What once inspired admiration now provoked discomfort. The visual language of excess clashed with a society increasingly aware of inequality. The estates became symbols not of success but of imbalance. Their very existence invited questions about fairness, access, and accountability. Silence, once protective, grew conspicuous. Attempts to preserve relevance took many forms. Some estates were opened selectively to the public, reframed as cultural landmarks rather than private fortresses. Others hosted charitable events, blending philanthropy with preservation. These gestures softened criticism but did not address the deeper issue. The estates remained artifacts of a system built on exclusion, no matter how welcoming their lawns appeared during guided tours. Eventually, practicality intervened. Taxes rose, maintenance costs escalated. The economic logic that once supported such scale no longer applied. Portions of estates were sold, land was subdivided, wings were closed permanently. What had been unified expressions of power fractured into pieces, each sale reducing not just property but narrative control. Some estates survived through reinvention. Converted into institutions, museums, or public facilities, they gained new purposes while shedding their original intent. Yet this transformation often stripped context. Visitors admired craftsmanship without confronting the conditions that produced it. History was preserved selectively, focusing on aesthetics rather than consequence. The estates became beautiful shells, disconnected from the systems that gave them meaning. Others disappeared entirely. Demolition arrived quietly, framed as progress or necessity. Photographs documented loss without explanation. The land moved on, carrying no visible trace of what had stood there. This erasure simplified history. Without the physical reminder, the dynasty's rise became abstract, easier to discuss without discomfort. The absence did not signal resolution, it signaled avoidance. As the estates vanished or transformed, the dynasty adapted. Power migrated away from land and into structures less visible and more efficient. Influence became financial, legal, and digital. The need for architectural dominance faded. Control no longer required gates or towers. It operated through systems that left no ruins when abandoned. The legacy of these estates, however, lingered beneath the surface. Zoning decisions, economic patterns, and social hierarchies bore their imprint. The concentration of land had shaped opportunity, and its redistribution did not erase inequality, only rearranged it. The estates had done their work. They had normalized the idea that extreme accumulation was not just acceptable, but admirable. Memory proved fragile. With each generation, fewer people remembered what these properties represented. Stories softened. Excess became nostalgia. Images circulated online, divorced from context, admired for beauty rather than interrogated for meaning. The estates transitioned from warnings to fantasies, their darker implications blurred by time. Yet the systems they embodied remained intact. The same mechanisms that allowed land, labor, and capital to consolidate under one name continued to function, now stripped of spectacle. Power learned to operate without monuments, making it harder to recognize and challenge. The estates had been honest in their visibility. Their disappearance made inequality quieter, not smaller. The dark legacy of these properties lies not only in what they were, but in what replaced them. By turning wealth into landscape, the dynasty reshaped how America understood success. By allowing those landscapes to fade without reckoning, the nation absorbed their lessons without confronting their cost. The estates built more than fortunes. They built habits of acceptance, systems of silence, and a version of history where power could erase its own footprints while continuing forward, uninterrupted. The estates that anchored America's MOS. Powerful dynasty were never intended to be simple places of rest or domestic comfort. From their earliest conception, they were designed as instruments, carefully calibrated to convert private wealth into unquestioned authority. Every decision, from location to scale, carried strategic intent. These properties were built to dominate landscapes, to rise above surrounding communities both physically and symbolically, signaling that power had arrived, settled, and expected to endure. Their purpose extended far beyond shelter. They were statements, made of stone and land, that wealth could shape reality itself. Architecture played a central role in this transformation. The estates borrowed heavily from European traditions associated with monarchy, nobility, and inherited rule. Grand facades, sweeping staircases, and vast interiors were not aesthetic indulgences alone, they were visual arguments. They communicated lineage where none existed, stability where fortunes were often newly made, and inevitability where power was still consolidating. By embedding themselves in architectural language associated with permanence, these dynasties reframed rapid accumulation as timeless legacy. Land ownership amplified this message. The estates were surrounded by acres of carefully controlled territory, separating their owners from the public and redefining access as privilege. Roads curved away from view, gates marked boundaries, and distance itself became a tool of authority. To approach these properties was to experience hierarchy before ever meeting their occupants. The land reinforced the idea that power required space, and that space could be claimed, enclosed, and defended through wealth alone. Within these estates, social life functioned as a continuation of strategy. Dinners, gatherings, and celebrations were less about leisure and more about alignment. Invitation signaled inclusion. Exclusion signaled irrelevance. Decisions that shaped industries, politics, and public institutions were often made casually in drawing rooms and libraries, far from public oversight. The estates provided a controlled environment where influence could be cultivated quietly, shielded from accountability by privacy and tradition. These properties also served as centers of cultural authority. Art collections, libraries, and curated interiors framed their owners as patrons rather than beneficiaries of economic imbalance. By presenting themselves as custodians of culture, dynastic families positioned their wealth as a public good, rather than a private concentration. The estates became proof that extreme accumulation was not only acceptable, but beneficial, enriching national identity rather than distorting it. The domestic structure of the estates reinforced hierarchy at every level. Servant corridors, hidden staircases, and segregated spaces ensured that labor remained invisible. The design taught everyone within its walls how power worked without explanation. Silence, discretion, and obedience were built into the architecture itself. The estate trained behavior as much as it displayed wealth, creating a self-sustaining system of dominance. Beyond their physical boundaries, the estates influenced how success was defined nationally. They transformed ambition into spectacle. Aspiration became tied to ownership, scale, and visibility rather than contribution or equity. By standing as the ultimate reward for success, these properties redirected cultural values, making extreme inequality appear not as a problem, but as a destination. The estate was the finish line that justified the race. The estates also anchored dynastic continuity. Inheritance gave power a physical anchor, something tangible to pass down and defend. Ownership of such properties made wealth feel earned through time rather than extracted through systems. Longevity replaced scrutiny. Once an estate existed for long enough, questions about how it was built faded, replaced by reverence for how long it had stood. Crucially, these estates operated outside democratic structures. They were private spaces where public consequences were shaped. While laws applied broadly, influence flowed selectively. The estates insulated their owners from the instability experienced by the wider population, allowing decisions to be made without exposure to their consequences. In this separation, power matured without resistance. Over time, the presence of these estates normalized imbalance. Their scale made inequality feel inevitable. Their beauty softened critique. Their endurance reframed concentration of wealth as tradition rather than disruption. They became landmarks not of individual excess, but of an accepted social order, one where power belonged to those who could afford to enclose it. What made these estates so effective was not just their grandeur, but their subtlety. They did not shout authority, they assumed it. Their owners rarely needed to explain their position, because the estates explained it for them. Stone, land, and space did the work of legitimization quietly and continuously. In this way, the estates were not passive backdrops to power, but active participants in its construction. They shaped behavior, perception, and memory. They turned economic advantage into cultural dominance and private wealth into public acceptance, embedding inequality into the physical and psychological landscape of the nation. While the estates projected authority and permanence, the systems that sustained them operated largely out of sight, dispersing their costs across society in ways that were rarely traced back to their source. The wealth that maintained these properties did not circulate evenly. It moved upward through networks of labor, finance, and policy that concentrated benefit while diffusing responsibility. The estates stood immovable and serene precisely because the instability they generated was exported elsewhere, absorbed by workers, communities, and envier. Enments far removed from the manicured grounds. Labor formed the foundation of this imbalance. Thousands of people contributed directly and indirectly to the maintenance of these estates, from domestic staff to industrial workers whose output financed their existence. Yet their lives unfolded in stark contrast to the comfort they sustained. Long hours, limited protections, and minimal security were common, while the estates themselves functioned as sealed worlds where hardship did not intrude. This separation was not incidental. It ensured that power remained unchallenged by consequence, allowing decision-makers to remain insulated from the human cost of their choices. Political influence flowed naturally from this concentration of wealth. The estates became informal centers of power where access replaced representation. Policy discussions occurred privately, shaped by personal relationships rather than public debate. Political figures were guests, not overseers. Influence was exercised quietly, through familiarity and favor rather than legislation alone. This dynamic blurred the boundary between public service and private interest, embedding elite priorities into governance without visible confrontation. Philanthropy played a critical role in stabilizing this system. Donations funded institutions, cultural landmarks, and social programs, but rarely challenged the structures that produced inequality. Charity addressed symptoms while preserving causes. The estates became symbols of benevolence as much as dominance, reframing concentrated wealth as a moral force rather than a structural problem. This narrative softened resistance and redirected criticism away from accumulation toward gratitude. Culturally, the estates reshaped how society understood success and legitimacy. Wealth was no longer merely economic, it was aesthetic and moral. The ability to curate beauty, sponsor art, and preserve tradition positioned dynastic families as guardians of national identity. Their estates were presented as cultural assets rather than private excesses. This framing transformed inequality into heritage, making critique feel like an attack on history rather than a demand for accountability. The environmental cost was similarly displaced. Vast landscapes were altered to accommodate these properties, often with little regard for sustainability. Resources were consumed to maintain appearances of abundance, while the long-term consequences were deferred. Rivers, forests, and soil absorbed damage that did not register within estate walls. Nature, like labor, became an invisible contributor, expected to give without recognition or limit. As decades passed, the rigidity of these estates revealed a paradox. Structures built to symbolize permanence struggled to adapt to change. Economic shifts, new social values, and evolving political pressures exposed their vulnerability. What once conveyed dominance began to suggest excess. Maintenance became burdensome, public. Scrutiny intensified, and the narrative of unquestioned authority weakened. The very visibility that once legitimized power now invited critique. In response, dynastic influence evolved. Wealth retreated from architectural display into abstraction. Power became less tied to land and more embedded in financial systems, corporations, and global networks. The estates, once essential to authority, became liabilities, too visible, too historical, too honest. Some were repurposed, others abandoned or dismantled, their disappearance framed as modernization rather than erasure. This transition marked a critical shift. The decline of the estates did not signify a reduction in power, but a refinement of it. Influence became harder to see and therefore harder to challenge. Without physical monuments to provoke comparison, inequality became less tangible. The absence of these estates removed daily reminders of disparity, allowing the system that created them to persist with less resistance. Memory played a decisive role in this process. As estates vanished or changed function, their histories were simplified or aestheticized. Craftsmanship was remembered, exploitation was not. The narrative focused on architecture rather than economics, beauty rather than imbalance. By controlling how these estates were remembered, dynastic power extended its influence beyond physical space into historical interpretation. What endured was not the stone or land, but the logic that produced them. The belief that accumulation justified authority, that scale implied merit, and that visibility could be managed to protect influence survived intact. The estates had done their work. They established a template for power that no longer required physical presence to operate, only precedent and acceptance. In this sense, the dark legacy of these estates lies not only in what they represented, but in what they taught. They demonstrated that inequality could be stabilized through culture, softened through philanthropy, and preserved through adaptation. Their rise and decline traced the evolution of power itself, from something that needed to be seen to something that preferred to remain unnoticed. As the physical symbols of dynastic power receded, the systems they had helped normalize continued to operate with remarkable resilience. The disappearance of estates did not dismantle the structures that produced concentrated wealth. Instead, it freed those structures from visibility. Power no longer needed gates, walls, or manicured grounds to announce its presence. It learned to function through abstraction, embedded in financial instruments, corporate governance, and institutional influence that rarely invited public scrutiny. This transformation altered how society perceived inequality. When power was architectural, it was difficult to ignore. Vast estates stood as daily reminders of disparity, their scale demanding comparison. Once those symbols faded, inequality became less tangible. It was measured in data, not space, making it easier to explain away and harder to confront emotionally. The absence of physical excess softened public perception, allowing wealth to appear more diffuse than it truly was. The shift also redefined legacy. Earlier generations of elites relied on land and lineage to secure permanence. Their successors learned that continuity depended on flexibility. Wealth was diversified, globalized, and shielded behind layers of ownership. Influence traveled through boards, trusts, and foundations rather than dining halls. This mobility ensured survival across political cycles and social movements. Power became adaptive, capable of reshaping itself without surrendering control. Institutions inherited much of this influence. Universities, museums, think tanks, and cultural organizations carried forward dynastic priorities under the banner of public good. Funding shaped research agendas, historical interpretation, and cultural memory. While these institutions provided genuine benefits, they also extended elite influence into areas that shaped values and knowledge. The legacy of the estates lived on, not in buildings, but in narratives and norms. This evolution made accountability increasingly difficult. When power is diffuse, responsibility becomes ambiguous. Decisions affecting millions are made through complex networks where no single actor appears decisive. This fragmentation protects influence by making critique seem unfocused or unfair. The clarity once imposed by physical symbols was replaced by complexity, which favored those with resources to navigate it. Public discourse adjusted accordingly. Debates about inequality shifted from moral questions to technical ones. Policy discussions focused on efficiency, growth, and competitiveness rather than fairness or distribution. Without visible markers of excess, it became easier to argue that extreme concentration was an abstract problem, disconnected from daily life. The emotional urgency that once accompanied stark visual contrast diminished. The disappearance of estates also affected how history was taught and remembered. Without physical sites to anchor narratives, the past became more malleable. Stories were simplified, sanitized, or romanticized. The hardships that sustained dynastic power were reduced to footnotes, while achievements were celebrated in isolation. The absence of confrontation allowed selective memory to flourish. In some cases, remnants of the estates were preserved as heritage sites, stripped of economic context. Visitors admired craftsmanship and design while remaining detached from the systems that enabled such excess. Preservation became E. Aesthetic, rather than analytical. The estates were frozen in time, disconnected from the inequalities that made them possible. This framing neutralized their capacity to challenge present assumptions. The long-term consequence was a cultural environment more tolerant of concentrated power. Without overt symbols to provoke discomfort, society adjusted to abstraction. Wealth operating quietly seemed less threatening. The lessons embedded in the rise and fall of the estates faded, replaced by narratives of innovation and merit that obscured continuity of influence. Yet the dynamics established during the era of estates remained deeply embedded. Networks formed in private spaces continued to shape public outcomes. Norms of exclusivity, access, and inheritance persisted, even as their outward forms changed. The estate had served as a training ground for power, teaching how to centralize influence while minimizing resistance. This legacy shaped responses to later crises. Economic shocks exposed disparities, but explanations often avoided historical roots. Solutions addressed symptoms rather than structures. The endurance of inequality was treated as complexity rather than consequence. The absence of clear historical markers made systemic critique feel abstract and detached from lived experience. Ultimately, the evolution of dynastic power revealed its greatest strength: adaptability. When visibility became liability, it embraced invisibility. When monuments invited scrutiny, it dissolved into systems. The estates had fulfilled their purpose by establishing norms that outlived them. Their physical decline marked not an end, but a transition. What remained was a landscape shaped by choices made long ago, operating quietly beneath contemporary life. The legacy of those estates persists in how success is defined, how influence is exercised, and how inequality is rationalized. Their disappearance did not erase their impact, it ensured that it would continue without interruption, unchallenged by the physical reminders that once forced society to look closely, taken as a whole. The story of these estates reveals that their greatest power was never in their size or splendor, but in what they normalized. They transformed extreme concentration of wealth into tradition, influence into inheritance, and inequality into something that appeared natural rather than constructed. When the estate stood, they made power visible and undeniable. When they disappeared, they made it quieter and more difficult to confront. Their rise and decline did not mark the beginning and end of dominance, but a lesson in how power adapts to survive scrutiny. The structures they helped legitimize continued forward, refined and insulated, shaping institutions, memory, and opportunity long after stone and land were gone. To understand these estates is not to dwell on a vanished past, but to recognize how deeply their logic still shapes the present, reminding us that when wealth escapes visibility without surrendering control, the absence itself becomes the most enduring monument of all.